Hello, this is Todd Luck, and because they can't all be winners, this is a review of Tarzan and Jane on Netflix. Now, if you've seen some of my other reviews of Netflix shows, you may have heard me mention this series.
This Ultraman series is nowhere near as bad as some of the worst I've seen. It's nowhere near as bad as like Tarzan and Jane.
This is a Netflix animated series aimed at children. These things are a dime a dozen. There's one for just about every franchise known to man. And honestly, most of them are forgotten. I mean, does anyone remember the one for Tarzan and Kong? Hopefully not, because they were terrible. Because there's a lot of kids shows that are very, very hard for me to sit through. Like, the CGI versions of Tarzan and Jane and Kong on Netflix are great examples of shows that just didn't work out quite so well. Okay, so, that's it. Like and subscribe for more videos, and until next time. No, I'm just kidding. So those are my opinions based on the first season of this series. The first season was 8 episodes, and I recently found out there is actually a second season I never knew about of this CG animated series. And so I decided to rewatch it and see what that second season was like. The plot synopsis for the episodes promised that it was going to have ruins of a lost civilization, it was going to end in Pellucidar, and it was going to have King Kong in it, so potential. So we're going to see if it did get better in that second season. So Tarzan and Jane is a CG animated series aimed at young children, which I think is wonderful because obviously young children have been into Tarzan for as long as that character has been in existence, not just consuming the novels, but also other forms of media like comic books. And the comics have tended to be very close to the novels, and so animation is a great idea because basically all you're doing is taking these drawings and making them move. And that's exactly what Filmation did in the 1970s when they did Tarzan, Lord of the Jungle, which was a very faithful version of Tarzan that was close to both the novels and the comics. In the 2000s, we got Legend of Tarzan, an animated series from Disney, which followed up on their Tarzan movie. And so their version of Tarzan is a bit different from the novels, but it retains a lot of the most iconic things about the character. And it even had its own version of Lav Opar, the Leopard Men, Pellucidar, and Nicholas Rockoff. And so in my opinion, animation is the perfect medium for Tarzan. And this particular animated series, Tarzan and Jane, actually had Avi Arad as its producer. And that sounds fantastic on paper because this is the guy who was involved in the Spider-Man cartoon in the 90s. He was involved in the Spider-Man movies. And so no one could accuse those of being too close to the source material, but they still had enough recognizable and iconic traits of the source material in them that they resonated with audiences. Unfortunately, that was not how Tarzan and Jane was done. This is an almost completely unrecognizable take on this character that doesn't resemble the novels or previous movies and shows, and is just quite different. So once again, we have a modern retelling of Tarzan where there's a plane crash in Africa that kills his parents and baby Tarzan is on board, and an ape and or gorilla named Kala finds the baby. In this version, Kala takes the baby who is dying to a local shaman. And keep in mind, this is modern day Africa, so it's a little weird that this village has a magical shaman, but he tries to save the baby, and Dr. Porter, who is later revealed to be Jane's father, is also there doing experimental medicine, and so they mix magic and medicine. And it saves little baby Tarzan, but also gives that baby animal powers. And so I want you to let that sink in for a minute. Tarzan in this series has magical animal powers. And so for some reason, the shaman is scared to let people from the outside know about his powers. This is really never followed up on. But for whatever reason, they thought the best way to hide those powers was to give him back to Kala to raise. They're handing a baby over to a wild animal to raise. And so Tarzan survives his childhood, raised by Kala, but the natives are still involved. They send a young boy named Maviro Waziri, who's a little bit older than Tarzan, to tutor him and teach him how to read and write and speak English. And so Maviro becomes Tarzan's best friend when he's younger. And so Tarzan does indeed develop magical animal powers. And so he is super fast like the Flash. He is super strong. He has enhanced hearing, and he also has enhanced sight. But when he uses the sight, his eyes become cat eyes, which is kind of freaky looking. And probably the most disturbing of all is he can magically turn his fingernails into cat claws, which just looks really weird. And you may think I'm kidding, but no, everything I'm telling you actually is in this series. He actually does grow claws. It's crazy. And so Tarzan grows into a reasonably intelligent teenager who wears shorts and he swings around the jungle. There's not a whole lot to his character. He gets really hungry. He doesn't like studying. He sticks up for animals and humans. And that's kind of it. In the second episode, he meets Jane, who in this version is a biracial teenage girl. Her father is a British doctor who we've mentioned previously, and then her mother is actually a movie star. And so she spent time with both of her parents, but seems to take more after her mother. She has an American accent, and she's apparently worked quite a bit in her mother's movies doing stunt work. And so it gives her kind of this variety of skills. She knows how to drive every vehicle, and she can do all this kind of acrobatics and stunt work and stuff. She instantly picks up on how to swing on a vine when Tarzan shows her, things like that. Makes her very capable. And so, of course, Tarzan and Jane hit it off, and they hang out, and then suddenly Tarzan is kidnapped. So Tarzan, in this version of the story, has a grandfather who is the Earl of Greystoke. This seems to be a nod to the Greystoke movie. And the grandfather hires some people to bring Tarzan to him, even though he doesn't know anything about his situation in the jungle. And for some reason, these people he hires kidnap him. I mean, they literally like throw a net on him and fly him off in a helicopter. But Tarzan gets over his anger at being kidnapped and ends up loving his grandfather and stays in civilization because of that. And he ends up going to school, which is kind of as boring as you would think, and meets Jane again. But he's angry at her because for some reason he blames her for getting kidnapped. And so, of course, Tarzan gets over it and teams up with Jane to track down an illegal poaching and smuggling ring in Europe. And for some reason, rich people want to own baby rhinos as pets. Maybe that's a thing. But Tarzan and Jane team up, and Tarzan wears these kind of preppy looking clothes with no shoes, and that's kind of his look. Curiously enough, Tarzan and Jane's relationship is portrayed as being strictly platonic, but you're obviously welcome to draw your own conclusions about where you think it would end up at. But it is kind of neat to see Tarzan and Jane as this kind of action couple taking on bad guys together. The poaching ring is led by some random dude named Jeremy, who just looks like a generic white guy with a beard. Yeah, it's not that exciting. Once we deal with the poachers, we spend the last half of the season dealing with sabotage at the Greystoke Foundation, which is run by Tarzan's grandfather. Jane's mother is introduced, and for some reason she decides to become a reporter very briefly. She's super obnoxious, but she does come to her senses, and her and the Earl of Greystoke end up kind of teaming up to help the kids, and they become the supporting cast for the rest of the series. They do eventually give us Clayton, and he is about as boring as you would expect him to be. His look may be modeled after the way he appeared in the silent movies, but that may be giving the show a little bit too much credit. And then there's this scene. And no, your eyes are not deceiving you. Tarzan is literally riding Jane who is flying in a squirrel suit. To be honest with you, I wish there were more goofy moments like this that would have made this show more fun. But unfortunately, I found the first season to be pretty boring, not just in its subject matter, but also the fight scenes tended to be slapstick. There tended to be very little contact between the people fighting. It was mainly just jumping around. If there were animal fight scene, which was very, very rare, it would just be him tumbling around with a jungle cat or something. No weapons are used or anything like that. It's definitely very, very kiddied down. And the animation, unfortunately, just looked kind of unfinished and didn't live up to the kind of expectations that you would have from other shows like the CG Turtles or Clone Wars. And then we get to season 2, and the first thing you'll notice is the animation is much better. Characters are much better rendered, the facial features look much better, you've got texture in the hair, and Jane actually has lips this season. The animals also look much better with more realistic fur, and there's just a lot more that they can do with them. They introduce a monkey named Midas who becomes their sidekick for the season. Unfortunately, all of this is wasted in the first episode because it takes place in Rio, where Tarzan and Jane once again are fighting, say it with me kids, poachers. But then we get to the second episode of season 2, and we go to the jungle of Brazil, and it looks beautiful. They're able to render a very convincing jungle, and it looks fantastic. This is exactly what a Tarzan series should look like. And we actually get real jungle action. Tarzan actually has to fight a giant anaconda with his bare hands underwater. It is freaking cool. And the next episode, they get pursued by spear-wielding natives in some very intense chase scenes. And Tarzan actually gets to tear stuff up with his strength. And once he defeats something, he actually puts his foot on top of it and gives a victory cry. And suddenly this scrawny kid, who's still way too skinny to be Tarzan, suddenly starts acting like Tarzan. And then they waste the fourth episode having Tarzan and Jane fight security guards in a lab. Yeah, it's still Tarzan and Jane. But it does get more interesting for the final episode, episode 5, where he does meet King Kong, and we get some cool scenes with giant animals. And yes, this is the kiddie down King Kong from that CG Netflix series I was complaining about. However, he's still a giant ape, and there's still some cool stuff that you can do with that. And as promised, it does indeed end in Pellucidar. Now, this is a little bit different from the novels. It's only 4 miles below the Earth's surface, but it is still a prehistoric world filled with dinosaurs. And to my surprise, there was actually a tribute to Tarzan at the Earth's core. It was a very brief scene, but it was kind of cool to see it in there. There was definitely some potential going forward. If there'd been a season 3, they probably would have set at least some of the episodes in Pellucidar. But of course, this show was canceled after the second season. And just on a weird side note, there have been a couple other instances where Tarzan met King Kong. There's a Tarzan and King Kong movie from India. This is unofficial, and unfortunately, the ape monster is human-sized in this one. And there's also an official novel by Will Murray called King Kong vs. Tarzan. And this is actually available to buy from EdgarRiceBurrows.com. I'm sure it's probably better than the musical Indian version. So does the second season change my opinion of the series? Not really. I mean, it's no longer a completely awful series from beginning to end, but it's hard to call it good. It's a series that has some good moments in the second season, and honestly, I think the second season is probably worth checking out, but it's hard to say that I would love to have seen a third season when the show was just such a mixed bag, and it took so long just to get some competency in what they were putting out. I mean, maybe the third season would have been great. Maybe they would have finally got all their ducks in a row, but it's hard to say. However, keep in mind, I am not in the target audience for this show. This is a show for very young children, and I would imagine that they would enjoy it. I remember when I was a young child, I pretty much liked everything I watched. I don't recall really disliking anything until I got older. You know, people always are like, you know, well, kids won't sit through that. I sat through everything that my parents watched, right? I sat through the local news, I sat through the world news, I sat through soap operas and talk shows and game shows and all of that. You know, I was just this voracious sponge of storytelling. And I'm not saying I didn't have my preferences. Like, for instance, there's a cassette tape recording of me where my mom was trying to read a Bible story to me, and I kept insisting that she read Star Wars to me. And it wasn't that I didn't like the Bible story she was trying to read me, it's just that obviously I preferred Star Wars maybe a little bit too much. And so with that in mind, I can imagine kids would like this series, but it's hard for me to imagine them preferring it over stuff like Power Rangers or Clone Wars or Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, because those have much more colorful, fantastic, imaginative characters in them. And the thing that kills me, though, is that's exactly what Tarzan is like. If you pick up the novels, that's exactly the stuff that's in there. Tarzan was always finding lost cities in Africa and finding characters like Lav Opar and her beastmen. He fought a civilization of intelligent gorillas. He encountered fuzzy people with monkey tails. He fought serpent men at the Earth's core. He fought leopard men, along with ant men. There's a cool looking Black Knight in one of the novels. And of course, Tarzan's fought dinosaurs, which I suppose the show did figure out at the very end. Despite the less than stellar results from this animated series, I still think animation is a really, really good way to do Tarzan on TV. And I would hope that at some point we will get another animated series that does use the source material, because Tarzan is one of the greatest action heroes of all time, and he needs to have opponents and be put in situations that are worthy of that and not be fighting poachers named Jeremy. All right, that's it. Like and subscribe for more videos. And until next time, see ya.